About the bastard stepchild dispositionality. Somebody said before, Pepsi, what's your real name?
Oh, Joseph.
I get to think about it. Could be Pepsi. Don't mess with the kid. All right. You said it earlier.
Whatever you want to call me.
Pepsi. You kind of got to the heart of this earlier. The general thesis of dispositionality is that counterplans can be treated like any other non-advocacy argument in debate. Not like a disad or an advantage, and there should be conditions under which the negative can kick it overall, right? What are the basic conditions we typically put on dispositionality? I like that look the way you raised your hand higher. Now call on me! In the back, you haven't talked to me.
Solvency, if we don't have any solvency on the counterplan.
You're going to go back to the other guy real quick.
Okay.
No, that's not quite it. You're in the ballpark. You're the one who said you didn't know what dispo was, so I'm excited.
Well, I mean, I kind of had this idea of it, but it's been skewed in my mind. First, I've heard
Let's unskew it.
you had to straight turn it, and then for some odd reason you didn't have to go for it, and that's the only way you would go for it. If they didn't put offense on it, I've heard like so many different
So
definitions.
if they straight turn it, then you can kick it?
Yeah, apparently I've heard so many.
Close. What are you going to say?
If it has a solvency deficit.
No. If it's permanent. That's one instance where it can be kicked for sure.
Yeah.
So one instance where we can kick it is there a permutation? What's another one? You're right. It's not a question when you can kick it. The question is really when they have to go through it. So we're kind of approaching this backwards. But the permutations are where they can kick it. I'm going to raise perm for just a second. Two worlds where they can kick out of it.
If the average has it, then
No. We have to go through the counterplan if and only if the following things happen. One is that you straight turn it. We need to talk about what that means for a second. Straight. I'm not like that. Straight. I can't turn it like that. Water away. How are we supposed to straight? Am I spelling it right?
A-I-G-H-E.
Okay. Straight thing. Staying school, kids. One is if it's straight turn. What's that? This is an interesting question. What constitutes a straight turn of something? And what would have to be straight turned in this world? Somebody.
Say the exact opposite, like hedge good, hedge bad.
No.
It's an impact.
Yeah.
But not necessarily a straight turn.
Who are you pointing at?
You read that the counterplan has a solvency deficit and that you solve for a net benefit.
Well, that's a great question. Does solvency deficit represent a straight turn? I bet some people are going to have very different answers on this. Because I'm an athlete, so I think. Yeah.
You non-unique the DA and then you turn it.
That's a straight turn, or you can impact turn to this end, and you got to the heart of it. The question is, a lot of people say, you'll hear this answer all the time. We'll ask you in cross-examination, what's the status of the counterplan? They say dispo. The next question is, what does dispositionality mean? Because there are multiple interpretations of what it could mean, right? And they'll say, if you straight turn the counterplan, or read theory, all right, we're stuck with it if you straight turn the counterplan. But how do you straight turn a counterplan? Read only disads to the counterplan? What they're really saying is if you straight turn the net benefit or benefits to the counterplan, we're stuck with it. Does that make sense? So if you say politics is my counterplan, state's counterplan, the net benefit to it is politics, and you impact term politics and say Romney's great, I'm stuck with the counterplan. So is a solvency deficit a disad to the counterplan? You say no? Yeah, definitely. Well, this is a debate you can have as well. The reason I think that it is that you imagine the solvency deficit argument that 2AC makes as a link to a disad. The disad is the advantage that it doesn't solve. There's uniqueness for that. The app uniquely solves it, right? The counterplan, for some reason, doesn't solve it, and the impact to it is whatever the impact is. That's a unique disad to the counterplan. So a solvency deficit, I think, can be that. Most negatives are going to disagree with you about that. But there's an argument that you definitely can and should advance on the affirmative. Does it make sense why it's disad? Maybe? No? Some of you just asleep, all sitting on? Yes?
So what you're saying is if, okay, the solvency deficit, if they go through the solvency deficit, they have to go for it?
Well, imagine if the only answers I made to the counterplan were like 3 reasons why it didn't solve my advantages.
The argument is if they straight turn it, which is not reading any defense, right? When straight turn it disat, it's just all offense. It's all terms. If you straight turn a counterplan, we're trying to figure out what are those offensive arguments. So if there's a counterplan and the app just makes 3 no solvency arguments, you don't solve the case, here's 3 reasons. Is that a straight turn? Why not?
Because, well, you look at it as offense, and, well, I mean, the way I started the straight turn is you only take offense as an affirmative, and you try to be it.
Okay. Let's say I have a hegemony advantage, right? And I have an environment advantage. Doesn't really matter. And in both these cases, US head is screwed if we don't do the plan, and the environment is screwed if we don't do the plan right. And the app has a uniqueness argument in the 1AC for both of these things. And you have a competitive policy. What are you about to explode?
It's
There.
Are we all about to die?
Yeah, probably.
Yes, everyone to the shelf. Alright, I have these 2. And the app uniquely solves them. Uniqueness argument, internal link, impact, solvency. And I win, and you're going for the counterplan, and I win. The counterplan can't solve the hegemony as well as you can. Let's forget about the environment for a second. I just win the counterplan can't solve the hegemony as well as the app can. How is that not offense in counterplan? There is no squo to backstop this or going for the counterplan. It's a link to a disat, which is hedge decline inevitable, plan key to save that, counterplan can't stop it with the uniqueness argument. The solvency deficit is a link to my disat.
You may have heard this phrased as case is a disad to the counterplan.
Is this after the two arguments?
Well, you make this argument in the 2AC.
Well, then, I mean, I still think they have to kick it and just defend the squad.
How do you, if the conditions under which you can kick a dispositional counterplan are if you make any defensive arguments or theory, but if you straight turn it, we're stuck going for it. How is, what did I say in the 2AC if I said there's solvency deficits in the counterplan that's defensive? That's the question we're asking. That's the problem. Negs don't want to, they'll say, for example, if they conceded the counterplan didn't solve the case as well, could you kick out of something that way? Treat it think of it like a disat. You kick out of it that way. Speak, I can't hear you.
It's just not but
Sure.
they just have to take away the offense and they can kick it.
But what defensive argument are you conceding? There's a unique advantage that the counterplan can't solve. That seems like offense to the counterplan to me. What you're saying though is what the negative will say. We'll just concede that it doesn't solve, therefore it goes away. Okay. More likely defensive arguments you hear are what? There's 2 big ones.
Scott just said it.
I did.
It was written on the board like 10 seconds ago.
Theory is one of them. You could say that theory. You could say dispositionality is not legitimate. We'll talk about those arguments in just a second. In which case, I could concede that dispo was illegitimate and answer whether or not it was a voting issue. Say reject the argument, not the team. In which case, counterplan might then go away because dispo is not a legitimate status for counterplan. Okay, that's one. What's the other one? Yeah, perm.
Yeah.
And in our analogy, where dispositionality means you treat a counterplan like you treat a disat in terms of whether or not you're stuck going for it, what answer is the permutation of? What does it function as? Yeah.
Offensive?
No. No. Right? Because dispositionality says treat the counterplan like it was a disat. If you make defensive arguments, we can concede them and the counterplan will go away. If you don't make defensive arguments, there's nothing for the negative to concede, they're stuck going with the counterplan. So if you impact turn the net benefit or link turn the net benefit and don't make any defensive arguments, you're stuck going with the counterplan. If you read only offensive arguments to counterplan, I say my only answer to the counterplan is the counterplan's bad. Here's a disadd to it. You're stuck going to the counterplan. So it's treated just like any other argument in favor in that way. What are some reasons if you're negative that you might think that was good? I mean, for one thing you can understand, and Dan said this, I thought, with a really cool story about that round at the Heart many years ago, is that dispositionality is a reaction to conditionality. The idea that an egg can kick the counterplan any time, eventually it kind of went out of vogue because it put the app, for all the reasons we said here, kind of behind the 8 ball. And so people kind of moved away from it for a while. They had to find an interpretation of the counterplan that allowed the app a little bit more room to maneuver. So what are some reasons the negative might say dispo is good? What's that? Yeah. With one hand, that's not. You're talking with conviction, man. Not even kidding around. What are some reasons that the neg might, if you're reacting to these arguments, what does the neg say? Remember how we said all of this in the debate about interpretations and net benefits to the interpretations? So what might the negative be saying? What does a dispositional counterplan allow the app to do that a conditional one does not? There we go. All right, somebody. One of the three of you will always answer their
Make the neg go for the counterplan?
You can force the negative to go. It's more fair. It's fair because you can force us to go for it. What's that? What are some other reasons? Yes. It allows the app to have offense. That's it. And these are not the only reasons. Basically, all the reasons that conditionality is bad are reasons why dispositionality is good, which is why we said that sometimes the app will use dispo as a counter-interpretation for conditionality. Counterplan shouldn't be condo, it should be dispo, because if you do that, then it forces us to go, you can force us to go for it and allows the app to have offense. Yeah?
How does any different from condo?
Because, well, hang on. Have we failed you?
No, because I mean, you can still put offense on a condo argument and they can take it. I mean,
Right. But if I only make offensive arguments to a dispositional counterplan, you can't kick it.
alright, so
That's it. Yeah, the question of this is, the difference between dispo and conditionality are the terms under which the counterplan can be kicked.
okay,
Does that make sense now?
Yeah, that's-
So if you make defensive arguments to dispositionality, in this case, the defensive arguments we're talking about are things like theoretical reasons why dispo is bad, right? And also reasons why, or a permutation, right? Those are reasons I can kick the counterplan. So 2AC gets to the counterplan and says perm do both. The negative can go to the counterplan and say concede, not competitive, not going for it. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So these are some of the main reasons. All these reasons over here, the app makes against conditionality are all reasons why dispo is better. At least that is the argument. So if you're app, and it's so much sweeter for you, what are some reasons dispo is bad? We're going to spend way less time with dispo, by the way. Help me. What are some reasons Nixon is displeased with their apathy? Yeah.
It disincentivizes making progress.
Bam! Landed on the moon at first try. Why? Does it disincentivize perms?
Because if you perm, they can just kick out of it.
If you perm it, it's functionally conditional. We'll concede the perm, counterplan went away. It didn't matter what disadd you read to it. Right? It's just condo and drag. Got all dressed up to come out and found out, oh crap, it's just condo. It's condo and drag. Dixon hates drag. What are some other reasons it might be bad for the affirmatory? A lot of reasons that apps will advance to why dispo is bad are actually reasons it's not bad for the app will advance reasons it's bad for the neg.
It overlimits the neg
How come?
because they can be forced to go for it.
Yeah, it messes with negative flex. Those are a reason. I mean, do you disagree with that interpretation of what they're saying? I think that's largely true.
I don't.
no reason why, I can't think of reasons why dispositionality is bad for the app.
Other than you forced me to make it perm.
Yeah.
Which I was probably going to make it anyway. Yeah.
Why is Dispo strategic in that case?
This is a historical question you're asking in a way. Dispo was strategic for a long time because the argument, the community consensus against conditionality became so strong that there had to be an alternative to it in order for you to have a counterplan that wasn't conditional. Does that make sense? So after a while, we were just so upset with the way conditionality went and the proliferation of it that we needed something that was an alternative to it. We came up with dispositionality. The 90s was a decade of dispositionality. Dispo was great in the 90s. It's like disco in the 70s. And it sucked. It sucked for the name.
It's like everything else.
It's kind of, the 90s music was kind of bad.
Disco sucked.
The people.
Disco was everyone from the 90s.
Brandon's just like
Especially me. Yes.
From a strategic standpoint, like, it's gaming for the day is if you wanted them to put offense on it, so then you have to go for it and you do it. And it's just
Yeah, but you have that choice if the counterplan is conditional.
Yeah.
There are, we're not even kidding, and we're not going to talk about Dispo for very long because of exactly this reason. There's not a lot of reasons why dispositionality is strategically made. Keep in mind, it was a reaction to conditionality. It was a reason why the counterplan didn't have to be conditional, and that was because it meant that you were quick to lose on conditionality. That's like the main reason for it. In the last decade or so, we've totally shifted back. Condo is the standard for almost everything. In fact, as I suggested a little bit earlier, and it never really changed for me, even throughout the 90s when we did this dispo thing, which totally sucked. But if the counterplan has no net benefit, is the counterplan, is it still in the debate? Right. So the counterplan doesn't have a net benefit, it's always conditional. So all counterplans by default are always conditional, based upon opportunity cost, right? There you go. That's kind of what we're getting to. Dispo doesn't make a whole lot of sense in that world, does it?
Yeah, because the app can then win. They can prove the app doesn't do anything, but they can still win because the counterplan is bad.
You have a question?
Isn't dispositionality hardly ever run? I mean, doesn't.
Yeah, so I think we just said that. Yeah, it is less common today. It is more often heard as an apt counter-interpretation to conditionality, which is pretty easy to beat because all the reasons we're saying dispo is kind of silly. Yeah.
isn't the three states in which there can be status like conditional, dispositional, and then unconditional? Unconditional is just like
You have to go to the counterplan.
Yeah. No matter how bad an idea it is.
There are no conditions that let you kick out of the counterplan.
So it's worse than dispo.
It's worse for the name. Yeah, all these things are getting increasingly worse for the name.
Yeah, it's awesome for the app. Someone's like, the counterplan's unconditional, we're like, cool.
One reason, don't read counterplans unconditionally, but one reason an unconditional counterplan is bad for the app, potentially, is that apps are structured to defeat the status quo. If you have an unconditional counterplan, you can nullify most of the ways, depending on the counterplan.
Yeah.
But 2AC is going to just
2AC's favorite thing.
destroy it. Yeah. That's the only argument I've ever heard why unconditional is bad for the app. An app team going for an unconditional counterplan is bad.
I'll say this. Unconditionality is useful maybe in the instance when you're reading a one-off page and you don't want to get in a theory case, but I still think you would want the ability to pick the alternative at some point. So.
And never back yourself into a corner on the negative and say you can't kick something.
Kick something if you're one off.
Say what?
Why would you ever kick something if you're one
The app can read a bunch of disats to the alternative, for instance. Reasons why the alt is bad, the app doesn't really solve, see the political and stuff like that, or your alt causes genocide or things like that. The negative can kick the alternative, not advocate the alt, and still win that the K turns the case and has an external impact like a union.
It's exactly, we gave an analogy this before, you kick the counterplan, they'll disad, the net benefit of the counterplan still links to the app, that's exactly the same. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not exactly the idea, but I know that there's some reason that listen to like a debate argument to defend Nanda, because I mean,
distracted by typing. So what were you saying? Say one more.
Well, that list is a debate argument right now, right?
Is there like a way we set it up, like, okay,
Well, we're gonna start talking about how to debate theory here in a bit.
Let's go ahead and start that now.
We're start that now, but you would want to, for at least the 2 and C, when you're answering conditionality bad, to have a block that's like, here's our core arguments, offensive and defensive, that we have, that are those arguments just warranted.
okay.
And then you also do want to answer the app arguments, like, we'll get to that in terms of how to debate it, actually.
The question, one, to start with how you debate theory in general is you have to start with what you know about your judge. It all starts with, like with all debates. You have to start with what the judge thinks about it. Judging philosophies would usually have a long explanation or some explanation of how they sort of come down on theory arguments. A lot of judges will say things like, I err negative on questions of conditionality, which gives you an idea that it's an uphill battle for you. I may err af on certain on certain other issues, and that gives you an idea of what they think overall. Bias is inevitable. There are maybe judges you're going to run into who are just like, I think condo is sweet, and it's almost impossible to convince me otherwise. I'm nearly one of those judges. Yeah.
But is that within reason? Like, is 9 counterplans still like a good condo? Is that within reason?
Yes.
Yeah, to me, because I think that if condo is good, it's good. I mean, like I said, a lot of these counter interpretations, like 1, 2, 3, whatever, don't make a ton of sense to me, because if you win any of your better arguments, your offensive reasons why condo is good, then I think it's probably good. What should mediate conditionality is not the number of counterplans, but it's not like what's reasonable in terms of the counterplan, so much as
The logic behind conditionality.
yeah.
The logic that you can kick it at any time and there's nothing you have to concede. Normally to get out of arguments, to kick a disad, you have to concede defense. To kick advantage, you have to concede defense. That's the same for most arguments you have generally. You have to concede some argument to get out of something that you've said.
With counterplans, you just say not going for it on the next.
If it's conditional, so you win that the logic of conditionality is good, i.e. that this type of we should not be forced to go for this, we shouldn't have to concede something to kick it. If you win that that's good, then there's really no objective way to limit that at all. Limited conditionality is just arbitrary.
Sometimes the negatives will advance a theory of conditionality called logical limited conditionality, which is we'll only have one conditional option in the status quo. We'll only have one conditional option in the status quo. That limits some of the app offense to it overall. It also limits what they can do. Man, I would never say I can only have one conditional option, because what happens when the app reads a bunch of add-ons?
Yeah, I would say you can have as many as you want.
Yeah.
On the negative, I think it is strategic to read some sort of interpretation that limits conditionality, because and then instead of having to defend the logic of conditionality against you could read 50 counterplans, you just say, no, we don't. But limit it to how many you're going to read, not to one or anything.
Yeah.
Second, do the multiple worlds interact? Like, let's say the counterplan multiple world interact with the K multiple world?
The argument about whether multiple worlds are good or bad.
Well, I mean, not the argument itself, but
So,
do they interact together?
Well,
Yeah, it could.
yeah. I guess it's up to the negative, really.
Is this a question? You're asking a question of can a K be a net benefit to a counterplan?
Somewhat, yes.
Yes, of course it can. Yes, it can. And let's not kid ourselves. The idea of an alternative is just and we'll talk more about this when we talk about fiat tomorrow. The idea of the alternative is really just a counterplan, right? It's a question of how much more leeway we give to debating the solvency to that and the implementability of those sort of things. And usually with K's, people get away with a lot more. Although, as you will hear, I bet both of us say tomorrow, I think K-doll should have to be something that can be implemented. I find this to be a very compelling argument for you. That you should have to have an instrumental implementation of your alternative. If your alternative, for example, is to say, stop thinking something, are you kidding me? How do I stop that?
Yeah, right.
Stop, stop securitizing
It
stuff.
doesn't have to be a policy that the government changes.
I disagree. I can be convinced that it should be policy.
All right.
That's probably good for you to know. Yeah, but, yeah.
Wait, so what if it's like an alternative that's like reject the argument, or reject like something like that? Like, how do you implement that?
That is saying vote for the squad. Now, that is an implementable alternative. You say
Yeah.
don't do that, and in the face of the AF, decide to say no to it. If you give me two options, like we should do A or B, and I think B is evil, I should just say no to B. Yeah.
In the essence of the cap case, they say that their alternative is do nothing, though. They say cap is bad, but in the end, it's not going to change anything. Then why go with the cap case?
If they win, the alt does nothing.
Like, they win that cap is like terrible. It's like poverty, people die from this all the time. But then they have nothing to stop capitalism from spreading. Where
Probably a reason to vote AF.
Then more
I mean, they could still win that, like, the app is intrinsically capitalist, and that the app will cause bad things to happen. The negatives argument would just be, like we talked about earlier, it's the app's burden to prove that they're better. There's something wrong with the status quo, and the app does something to remedy that. If the negative can prove, like, the app does something wrong, that could arguably be a reason still to vote negative.
And there could be a uniqueness argument.
Yeah, they
could
could make
you like
uniqueness
revolution is
argument.
coming. It's inevitable.
But it's like the example everyone gives, like racism exists, and there's probably not a lot we can do to stop racism, but does that mean the app should win because even if they're racist, right? They should probably be punished in some way for being racist.
All right, so as we're debating theory, one of the things we start with is what the judge thinks, and you need to know what a judge thinks. Or at least have some kind of idea. Read their judging philosophies. Ask them if you have to. Ask your coaches. Ask other people. Keep track of the people who judge you and what they think about these things. Post-trial disclosures are a great time to kind of pick judges' brains about what they think about that. Keep sort of your own little database of the people that you judge, the people you know don't like conditionality, don't like dispositionality, are okay with lots of multiple worlds, ones that aren't, ones that are okay with whatever kind of counterplan, so on and so forth. But when we debate theory in general, we debate it much like we do topicality. And the question we're asking ourselves, as I said, this is always an interpretation of who has a better world for debate. What are the impacts of these things? In order to win the conditionality bad as a voting issue, what kind of impacts do you have to access? Yes?
Fairness and education.
Bam! And then on the move again. Well.
At least you're listening.
Yeah.
Well done.
Impacts. Fairness and education. Somebody give me an idea what you mean by fairness.
Debate's fair.
What?
What
does that mean? To be
Both sides have equal chance to win.
Equal, yeah, exactly. Equal chance to win.
As close to equal as possible.
Yeah, it can't be 100% equal. And what about education? Yeah?
It still allows us to like expand our knowledge on different areas of topics.
That what we're doing allows us to learn. It creates an environment where we learn.
It doesn't have to be just topic knowledge either. Like critical thinking is something that we learn from. It's a different type of education than learning about transportation laws.
Every argument we debate in theory, we're going to ultimately come down to one of these two things. And people will sometimes make permutations of fairness argument that are sort of like, if the game is unfair, what does that mean to us? The game's rigged against you. How long do you play it?
Not long, you'll quit.
Yeah, you can't ever win the game. Or, Nake's always going to win because conditionality is that bad that people don't play the game very long, right? I'm not sure I think people quit debate because if I've learned anything, it's like, we don't quit debating because we lost. We make better arguments, but you get the idea.
So what do we do instead of quitting? Because I've always heard that don't say quit because that's not a very persuasive argument to make.
All right,
What's the alternative?
The alternatives talk about, if you're not quitting, the alternatives discuss it in terms of your opportunity to win the debate.
Yeah.
And then also, if you lose that argument, it does start to then intersect, I think, with education.
Right. If the debate is not fair, if you're strategically or structurally disadvantaged, it's going to be less educational because there's a bunch of things you have to overcome to get back to ground zero than having a debate.
Do you think people quitting is good or bad?
I think it's a bad argument. I've heard it, and we have, I would like make it in framework debates where it'll be like a novice participation drops or
That's what I said,
debate
yeah.
doesn't expand or something. Like if
Programs die,
if
programs
programs,
go this
if
way.
debate's really unfair, like people on the fringe, novices who are just starting to debate, programs that are very new, those people who just start debating may quit, and that is bad for debate if you think the activity is good in some sense.
Would you vote on that then?
I mean, if the other team dropped it, yeah, if they're winning it. It's like, I'll vote on most arguments if they're one.
Yeah, it's very, there's almost nothing for me that I won't vote on if it's conceded or debated better by one team or the other. All right, so we said that sort of all these debates are kind of like debating this, kind of like debating topicality. So what do you think the uniqueness questions are in your debating theory? And you do have to deal with the question of uniqueness. It's very important, actually. Yeah.
Or maybe like conditionality or like dispositionality, or like, yeah, probably like what, like conditionality is like so entrenched that like you can't like get rid of it or something, or like that, like everybody always runs things conditionally, or I don't know.
Yeah, try to think of the uniqueness arguments more in terms of these questions. Like what kind of uniqueness questions would you have to ask about those impacts?
Think of it this way. What is the uniqueness argument for a disad saying?
Does that work? Like,
When
it's
you-
not, it's
Status
not,
quo, all right.
Yeah, it's what's happening in the status quo. So what is your uniqueness argument on the theory debate?
It's fair. Fairness is fine now. What you do is better.
What if I said half negative win percentages are within 1.5 points of each other? That's a uniqueness debate for things are probably okay, right? Definitely intersects with the idea of fairness. If ass and eggs are winning on balance a similar number of debates, then it seems like things are pretty fair. That's the ideal situation, 50-50. If you look back at the end of the season and say, the ass and egg won approximately the same number of debates, and wow, you had a really good topic and a really good debate season. So that's one thing you're looking for. If you start to approach things, you see this with stuff like international fiat a lot in the last couple of years and other things. You start to approach it and say, look, people are flipping nags 75% of the time in out rounds and winning 65% of those times. Uh-oh. That's a huge skew. That means something about the way we're constructing the fairness question of the debate, whether it be dispositionality or international fiat or any other thing we're kind of letting the community get away with, isn't working. Or the top, yeah. So you wrote a topic where the app had no chance of winning from good. And still, last year win percentage was more than 5 points of each other. Although flipping negative was like out of control. Yeah.
Was that the argument you made in the 90s about not knowing how we should have this dispo?
Honestly, it wasn't quite that sophisticated when the dispositionality debate started. We still debated the kind of uniqueness question about the win-loss percentage. What about the question of education? Is there any way to quantify that with uniqueness? To be honest, I don't know what the answer to this question
debate is educational now.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, you could talk about numbers would be one way to do it, that programs are expanding, more new programs, and there are the programs that are going away. One thing that happens a lot in debate is that schools will shift from one style of debate to another. So there's more policy teams than there were 10 years ago, or there are less. Some of them are becoming public forum teams that are doing mock UN or something else that's totally useless. Like that. Come on, we all know, right? Policy debate's awesome. Those kind of suck, right?
It's okay.
Right. Not even kidding about that. Numbers drop when people quitting.
Side bias arguments could be educational uniqueness arguments. Like the AF has infinite prep time right now as a uniqueness argument for why the topic may be more educationally skewed towards the negative.
Yeah.
Another one is arguments about the literature base. There's no card. For instance, last year on the college topic, there was like one card that said there was one U.S. key warrant, maybe. Probably in the unknown.